Good morning. My name is Anna Josephine B. Johnstone, and I'm really delighted to be sharing some work with you today. Sorry I can't be there in person, but big thanks to John and the whole team for still including my research. So I'm going to be sharing some research from my wider PhD thesis, which I'm doing in the Psychosocial Studies Department at Birkbeck with Dr. Gail Lewis and Dr. Margarita Palacios. And I will just dive right in. But just to say, I'll share my contact details at the end, and do feel free to email me or drop me a line if you have any questions or thoughts. I'd be happy to hear them. Intimate ecologies, queer speculations on pleasure, blackness, and art. Where does the sensual live with an interdependent Black ecology? Through what textures, aesthetics, and conversations might these Black, intimate ecologies be traced? In what ways has Blackness been removed, severed through violence, and removed itself through more subtle violences from the more than human world? How can these processes of excision be made visible and traced within the context of contemporary Ghana? Across what geospatial and spatiotemporal lines, through which mediums of travel, by what codes of understanding do intimate ecologies remain present? How may they be found again, bobbing resiliently amidst currents of the speculative, changed but resonant, rememoried amidst Black and Indigenous cosmologies of the diaspora? And why this urgent seeking, longing, tracing of intimate ecologies now? Why this insistent return to pleasure within contexts of climate colonialism, when the queer world building project of striving towards Black, interdependent, interspecies futures has never been more precarious or more necessary? These are some of the questions my research, Intimate Ecologies, Queer Speculations on Pleasure, Blackness, and Art seek to address, to propose, to invoke, and to bring into interdisciplinary conversation with the ancestors, both living and present elsewhere, with more than human kin, and with the artists and arts practices which first aestheticized a truth my body remembered, but my tongue had been taught to forget. Because the practice, understanding, and theorization of the cosmological framework I refer to as intimate ecologies has remained so resistant to articulation, both in English and in the academy, it has been necessary to suspend disbelief throughout the researching and writing of this project, to mark evidence by its absence. Suspending disbelief is a phrase used in the theatre to describe an unspoken agreement between the performers and the audience, to dissolve the fourth wall, that ephemeral barrier between the stage and the amphitheatre, between the real and the imagined, between the possible and the speculative. In other words, it has been necessary to believe my body. It is possible that as you enter the spiraling logic of intimate ecologies, meaning will first emerge in your body as well. I therefore ask you too to suspend disbelief whilst the mind, particularly if your mind was, like mine, conditioned predominantly by Western, neo-colonial, heteronormative and secular ontological frameworks, catches up with the somatic knowledges of the body. If it helps, you might treat this research like a story, like a fiction, like a play that both does and does not concern you, your life, your history, your positionality, your future, your ecologies. For what is history or truth but a fiction of one kind or another? And what is futurity if not the expansion of selves and relations we might perform? In any case, as a central endeavor of this work is to honor those ancestors who not only lost and continue to lose their lives, but their life ways to colonial occupation, displacement, dispossession, epistemicide, ecocide, enslavement, and the afterlives of slavery, then perhaps one of the greatest mediums of remembering, and by remembering, honoring, is the story itself. As Professor Zadia Hartman laments, loss gives rise to longing, and in these circumstances, it would not be far-fetched to consider stories as a form of compensation or even reparations, perhaps the only kind we will ever receive. 1. A wayward erotics. Quote, I think it is healing behavior to look at something so broken and see the possibility of wholeness in it. That which I've termed intimate ecologies are a mode of understanding one's existence as both interconnected to and codependent on the more than human. Earth, fungi, plants, animals, insects, bodies of water, bodies of weather, bodies of gas, which one regards as kin, as lover, whose thrivation is an extension of our own autonomous generative orgasm of one's own breath. Intimate ecologies can be understood as a form of relation, acknowledging stewardship, interdependence, and intimately intertwined modes of becoming with the non-human. Becoming with is Donna Haraway's phrase. Intimate ecologies are in direct opposition to colonial capitalist economies of extraction, individualism, and anthropocentric domination. Within an ontology of intimate ecologies, humans are therefore in constant transformation, co-creating an ecology in which we are becoming with, intimately, sensually, pleasurably, not because we have to in order to survive, but because we desire to in order to truly live, to live free. The difference may seem subtle or even inconsequential, but does, I argue, have the power to re-energize, sustain, and change the discourses of climate change survival and our imagination of post-climate changed worlds and of Blackness persisting within them. In her 2019 monograph, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, Professor Saidiya Hartman theorizes the wayward as everyday forms of resistance, of living otherwise and striving towards pleasure and thus freedom in the afterlife of slavery, again her term, when freedom, particularly for poor Black girls, as she writes of them, seemed impossible. Wayward, related to the family of words, errant, fugitive, recalcitrant, anarchic, willful, reckless, troublesome, riotous, tumultuous, rebellious, and wild. To inhabit the world in ways inimical to those deemed proper and respectable. To be deeply aware of the gulf between where you stayed and how you might live. I would like to position Hartman's waywardness as descended from and sibling to a lineage of Black feminist and Black LGBTQIA+ identified thinkers working with and toward the erotic. An erotics that encompasses the act of speculation, of flirting with fragile ecstasies, embodiment, transcendence, discomfort, fiction, of engaging Kagura Macaria's frottage, of moving through the flesh to elsewhere, to think with Amber Jamila Musa, of seeking out sweetness, in the words of Ginaldo Petrus Nasser, of courting Christina Sharp's monstrous intimacies, or to wrap our lips around Omaseki Natasha Tinsley's tongue, of thieving sugar. An act of birthing worlds in the slow, everyday refusal to settle for what one is given, for all one is told one can be, for the little one can have, can own, can contain, can squirrel away for later, for never, for someday. And be grateful for it, for the later, for the never, for the someday is never, for the little, for the all is so little. Hartman's waywardness traces the steps of a dance intimate ecologies can get down with, lay down, down low, way down, down and dirty, and good and pure and free. Waywardness, Hartman writes, the avid longing for a world not ruled by master, man, or the police, the errant path taken by the leaderless swarm in search of a better place than here. Hartman's waywardness is both site-specific, born out of her archival research into early 20th century Philadelphia and New York, and capacious, spanning a range of social experiments in intimacy and kinship, whose legacies Black communities are still working through today. Thinking with Hartman's theorization of the wayward, I formulate intimate ecologies as a wayward erotics, a harbor and a wound-licking seedbed for the wayward, the witches, queers, and spiritualists, the ancestors, gods, and rituals, cosmologies the gnashing maw of colonialism could not quite imbibe, appropriate, assimilate, or gnaw into obscurity. Intimate ecologies as a wayward erotics resists the violent oversimplifications of a colonial erotics that reduces the oppressed into thinghood, commodified and extractable, and the power-hungry into that which Sylvia Wynter has presented as, quote, our present ethnoclass, i.e. Western bourgeoisie, a conception of the human man which overrepresents itself as if it were the human itself. We might think of this commodification too as that which Audre Lorde has termed the pornographic, quote, the trivial, the psychotic, the plasticized sensation, a direct denial of the power of the erotic, for it represents the suppression of true feeling. 2, the Black aesthetics of intimate ecologies. The perceived inarticulatability of intimate ecologies inherent within Blackness or Black cosmologies is one of the reasons this project has been driven by visual and literary analysis. I think with African political science and queer studies scholar S.N. Nayak, who writes, still, saying the unsayable and speaking the unspeakable need not be restricted to a discourse of pain. It is a practice of resilience that retrieves the diversity of contemplative practices and the possibilities for which they evoke for present and future Africana households. Further, I'm interested in what is or can only be articulated through the language of aesthetics, thus not remaining unspeakable so as to avoid assimilation into the academic thus not only remaining unspeakable so as to avoid assimilation into the academic canon, which so often keeps and reproduces colonial power, but hearkening to that which discourses of negritude, including Senegalese philosopher Souleymane Bachir Diagne and others, have phrased African art as philosophy. A Black aesthetics evading the capture of the one-dimensional African savage, the feral blank canvas, or the 19th century scene, la négresse, or femme africaine, unto which civilization and capitalism were to be imparted. Intimate ecologies makes for sustainable and infinitely diverse Black futures, as opposed to the singular final genocidal path currently carved out as the only future for Black people and Blackness on the continent by the Western scientific canon and ontological frameworks through which apolitical discourses of climate change are produced. Similarly, Hartman utilizes her methodology of critical fabulation to read depth, complexity, and resistance into the afterlives of slavery in an attempt to reparate them from the archive, which she has called a death sentence, a tomb, a display of the violated body, an inventory of property, and asterisks into the grand narrative of history. So I'm trying to do a kind of similar thing here with intimate ecologies, thinking about Black futures as Hartman is doing in attempting to reparate these Black pasts. In so doing, Hartman reads waywardness into this collage of fleeting images, fragments of life, love, pleasure, resistance, and possibility. Her reading of a black and white photograph labeled only in the Philadelphia Temple University Library Special Collections Research Center, 2 girls sitting in stairwell Lombard Street cellar living, thus becomes the rag seller's daughters, idle on the steps that descend into their cellar flat. The eldest is respondent. Is it respondent or is it resplendent? I think it's resplendent, sitting amid the debris in her Sunday hat and soiled frock. The youngest remains mystery and blur. What can you hear if you listen? The eruption of laughter, the volley of curses, the shouts that make tenement walls vibrate and jar the floor. Yes, oh baby, that's good. The sweet music of an extended moan that hushes the ones listening, eavesdroppers wanting more, despite knowing they shouldn't. Waywardness breathes life not only into the archive, but animates it as well, puts clothes to it, as Professor Stuart Hall has invoked. Waywardness here offers the potential for depth, dust, musk, and intimacy, all in an evocative, irrevocable rhythm that catches up the reader and parades them down the narrow, fleshful alleyways into, quote, the terrible beauty of the slum, end quote. Following this tactic, I read the wayward erotics of intimate ecologies through the methodological approach I have referred to as decolonial aesthetics analysis. Simply put, a way of reading images through decolonial and decolonizing lenses in order to make meanings other than those presented by hegemonic systems of oppression, marginalization, and violence. Thus, the unseen impossible becomes seen because we believe it to be possible through this way of reading, as I work to illustrate here. In the purely ecstatic lime gagging of Nigerian photographer Rotimi Fani-Kayode's Nothing to Lose 3 Bodies of Experience, there is, I argue, a remembered way of knowing. In the immersed blacknesses and inescapable oppositional gaze of South African visual activist Zanele Moholi's Zabo, or the phenomenology of Kenyan artist Wangechi Mutu's series, A Fantastic Journey, there is an erotic becoming with, an embodied understanding of pleasure with and for the more than human. The tentacular grass-skirted altars in wide-thighed exaltation offering up parrot-filled palm fronds in Muti's Le Noble Sauvage offer, I argue, a visual language across which notions of a sensual Black ecology, a queer and flighty tremor, might seem to invoke the troubling notion of inherence. From here, I argue, one can begin to move from the inarticulatable longing to a shared rememorying, and thus into experience. Through this visual analysis, Black cosmologies are rehydrated by the tears and sweat of their descendants in a series of erotic gestures moving toward multi-species justice through indigenous epistemologies that have persevered and mutated under the pressure of cultural and environmental colonial encounters, displacement, and occupation. It is my belief that through such aesthetic languages in which sensuality, Blackness, queerness, and ecology think, breathe, and speculate together, we might come to better articulate and understand the realms Blackness can inhabit, a capacious Blackness. Such a question remains urgent in the face of not only mass migration, adaptation, and dispossession at the hands of dramatic environmental change across both the African continent and the Black diaspora, whose sites of displacement and relocation are often those most susceptible to environmental precarity. This desire to think Blackness, pleasure, and the more than human together also remains urgent as still colonial classifications of Blackness continue to constrict, police by violence, persecution, epistemicide, and exile. Through the prism of intimate ecologies, I consider what becomes possible, or as when we take as our hermeneutic, our epistemological approach for understanding the human, ourselves, in relation to all that lives around us, not read through wealth, power, gain, and social elevation, but rather through pleasure, sensuality, and an aesthetics of abundance. Quote, in search of a better place than here to live free, as Hartman writes. Such an ontology would, of course, be identified as not only antithetical, but also fundamentally dangerous to a growing global capital built on the violent extraction of peoples and more than human ecologies, unregulated economic growth, and that which Walter Mignolo describes as, quote, the invention of nature and the degradation of life. In Ghana, there is an Akan proverb, which is often associated with the symbol and epistemology of the Sankofa bird. Sewo were fi na wosonkava a Yankee, which I have probably bastardized because my my Akan is terrible. It is not wrong to go back for that which you have forgotten, is the translation. I find that which we may have forgotten in the aesthetics, sounds, and affective emulations of Black art, in the visual activism of Moholi, who states that Zabo, pictured here, where they stand nude, barely decipherable as separate to this giant bonsai tree, quote, Moholi, it was my dream to be part of that environment, to see myself disappearing and reappearing, fusing. I wanted to remember me as a part of that cluster. end quote. In the photography of Rotimi Fani-Kayode, who gives homage to his queer Yoruba heritages, to which his images pay tribute here in this essay, Traces of Ecstasy, where he writes, as for Africa itself, if I ever managed to get an exhibition in, say, Lagos, I suspect riots would break out. I would certainly be charged with being a purveyor or a purveyor of corrupt, decadent Western values. However, sometimes I think that if I took my work into the rural areas where life is still vigorously in touch with itself and its roots, the reception might be more constructive. Perhaps they would recognize my smallpox gods, my transsexual priests, my images of desirable Black men in a state of sexual frenzy, or the tranquility of communion with the spirit world. Perhaps they have far less fear of encountering the darkest of Africans' secrets by which some of us seek to gain access to the soul. These were the visual and literary speculative sites that affirmed the existence of intimate ecologies for me before I dared to articulate those longings and emotions, let alone to theorize them. They are proof that this way of seeing and being with the world is not a Western import, but a spiderweb of indigenous cosmologies, echoed from the African continent, however much more faintly, as they are from other indigenous languages, origin stories, myths, and legends from across Turtle Island and the Pacific continent, where they have been more explicitly documented. In the face of so many silences, so many absences, this research works to offer a language for that which we do not know we know, for becoming otherwise. In conclusion, then, I argue that the blueprints and traces for ways of knowing, practicing humanity, here termed as intimate ecologies, can be evidence through the artworks, visual, narrative, and poetic, of those creating on the continent and in the Black diaspora, often across lines of queer assemblage, whether implicitly or explicitly mapping out modes of multi-species justice and thus multi-species futures. For a speculative writer and essayist, Samuel R. Delany has written, "We need images of tomorrow, and our people need them more than most. Without an image of tomorrow, one is trapped by blind history, economics, and politics beyond our control. One is tied up in a web, in a net, with no way to struggle free." It is therefore the tracing, documentation, and speculative ideation of pleasurable practices here thought with as intimate ecologies via the speculative aesthetics and conversations through which I will argue that we can animate, I do argue in my wider research, that we can animate not only these images, but also these tomorrows. I explore whether these alternative ways of being and understanding, of rehearsing pleasure as praxis, these wayward erotics, when in conversation with speculative and decolonial theories and practices, can become necessary tools needed to manifest alternative Black, queer, climate change futures in Ghana, on the continent, and across the Black diaspora. In my wider research, I have argued for the existence of these wayward erotics in a plethora of Black contexts, both on the continent, with a particular focus on ex-British colonies, and in the diaspora. I have foregrounded this argument by drawing parallels between, for example, the perceptible and increasingly virulent war on non-heteronormative lifeways and sensual intimacies in contemporary Ghana, and particularly in urban centers, despite an array of evidence of, for example, multi-gender deities within Ga culture or instituted terminologies for same-sex relationships, such as Supi. You saw Fani-Kayode there referring to transsexual priests, or for another example would be the Azande people of contemporary Sudan, who before British colonial rule from the 1890s frequently engaged in same-sex marriages, with the women sometimes using root vegetables as dildos, which remain obscured from the majority of Black discourses on Blackness and identity, and at best are viewed as anomalies or exceptions rather than the norm, to which patriarchal British colonization was the aberration. I argue that these cognitive dissonances indicate a deliberate erasure and secreting away of ontologies under violent conditions of occupation and religious domination that might sustain resistance, self-reliance, and interdependence. By taking Hartman's wayward interventions into the material archive as a point of departure, this paper works to distill intimate ecologies from the visual archive of certain artworks, poetics, and literatures, as well as the more than human life, which I've explored in other papers. Waywardly looking toward the aesthetic gestures of intimate ecologies, lying thinly veiled, shallow breathing of many of the Black artists from across the continent and the diaspora, elucidates what Hartman has called the attempt to elude capture by never settling. Thus, as with Hartman's theorization of the wayward, intimate ecologies become the attempt to elude capture by never settling, a queer resource of Black survival, a beautiful experiment in how to live. Thank you. And you can reach me, here.